The Rotoworld Football crew is here to discuss our preseason fantasy football rankings. We'll start at the quarterback position, and we'll start off with Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes. Absolutely no surprise that they make up our tier one. Pat, easy question to start. Why?
We have eyes. We look for like really complicated, complex reasoning for everything we say. But I mean, there's no secret sauce here. Just two special players, both do it two different ways. Patrick Mahomes, the most explosive downfield passer we've seen maybe in 10, 15 years. And Lamar Jackson, explosive downfield passer, also, the truly, unprecedented dual threat with his legs. And there's no complex reasoning here. They're the two best quarterbacks by miles, and that's why they're in a tier by themselves at the top. But I think Mr. Hayden Winks probably has more eloquent reasoning beyond that for why they're there.
I'm definitely an eye test guy as well, and it's definitely clear. But yeah, for the stats, 2 years ago, Patrick Mahomes threw for 50 touchdowns. Last year, Lamar Jackson breaks the rushing record at quarterback. So it's pretty easy to see why from a statistical perspective they're in a tier of their own. And last year, I think the floors of both of these players were just so high. Lamar Jackson was rushing for like 40-plus yards every single game. Then when he wasn't rushing, he was throwing touchdowns left and right. So I think both of these offenses are just juggernauts. They didn't lose that many pieces on both sides of the ball. I think those are probably going to be the two best teams in the NFL, so that's why they're in a tier of their own. The question becomes for fantasy is, do we draft them in the second round, or do we draft them in the third round, the fourth round? Where do we draft them? I think that their upsides kind of justify a late third round draft pick, but Dago, what do you think about that?
I have had numerous listeners and readers actually DM me their boards the past week. I didn't request them. They're just coming to me. And I will say it served as a reminder that in your typical home and recreational leagues, whether it be redraft, superflex, or two quarterback leagues, the fact is quarterbacks remain overvalued. And thus, you should wait for the second or third tier in the mid to last rounds, as opposed to reaching for these guys, unless, of course, Mahomes and Lamar in a regular one quarterback redraft league fall to like the fifth round. But odds are that just doesn't happen because I never see it happen. But as for their fantasy production, we know they're going to be 1 and 2. The question is, can Mahomes, with all the rushing, the 11 fantasy points just via his legs per game and 15 starts last year for Lamar Jackson, can Mahomes possibly top that? And I think the path is those last 4 games he played and the 7 carries he averaged at least in those 4 games. Every single game, at least 7 scrambles. And that's how Mahomes, still the better arm in the league, gets there to become the QB1 overall.
Well, let's dive down into some of those other tiers and maybe more likely quarterbacks that will exit fantasy drafts with. Let's go to tier number 2, and it starts with Dak Prescott, 3, Deshaun Watson, 4, Kyler Murray, 5, and Russell Wilson, 6. Dago, I actually want to turn this right back on you because we know Dak Prescott in some ways had a breakout campaign in 2019, and you actually have him at the top of this tier at number 3.
You cannot play devil's advocate for Prescott because there's absolutely nothing wrong with his offseason. Last year's Cowboys already recorded the 9th most yards per play since 1970. And now they logically traded Jason Garrett, Jason Witten, and Randall Cobb for Mike McCarthy, who in his last tenure with the Packers was the most aggressive coach on 4th downs. Thus, we should project for more offensive possessions for the Cowboys. For Blake Jarwin, who adds more yards after the catch than Witten just by throwing on a jersey and sitting down in the locker room. And then CeeDee Lamb, who, it's CeeDee Lamb. He was the first-round rookie they grabbed. He's a strength adding to a strength of this offense. So there's no concern for me about Prescott whatsoever in a contract year after performing career highs across the board in his first year with Kellen Moore, who returns to call plays for another year.
Pat, I would love to go to you about Deshaun Watson, who you have as number 4, because this is really going to be the first time we see Deshaun Watson, one, without Bill O'Brien calling the plays, but also, and maybe most importantly, without DeAndre Hopkins. I'm sure that'll give drafters some cause for concern that he lost a bona fide number 1 wide receiver this offseason.
Yeah, someone he had like a mind meld with, too. There was kind of like a Brady Edelman thing between Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins. But, there were a lot of ways to go about this other than trading DeAndre Hopkins. But the Texans, arguably almost have a more balanced, better overall offensive setup this year, like a kind of like a textbook offensive setup where you have the outside burners and Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks. Then you have Randall Cobb who can eat over the middle. It's a few tight ends that are kind of could be target hog types over the middle. Maybe even Kiki Cutie gets involved in the party. So, and then like 2 running backs who are also very versatile, and David Johnson and Duke Johnson, that amongst the best pass catching backs of the past 10 years, and just a very balanced overall setup on offense. Basically, really like a textbook way you would want to design an explosive passing offense. And like we've said in the past, Bill O'Brien sometimes makes life like overly difficult for Deshaun Watson. So that is a huge positive, even though we don't know anything about Tim Kelly. So just kind of like some good renewal on the Texans offense. And despite trading an all-world talent, still a very balanced overall setup. And just something, this is just a great setup for any quarterback. With Deshaun Watson, who still doesn't get enough credit for his legs. I feel like third or fourth in the league in quarterback rushing since he debuted, even though he only made 7 appearances as a rookie. So he just kind of has the entire package. Would have preferred that it still included the all-world number 1 receiver. But yeah, he still has one of the best setups in the NFL at quarterback.
Pat, it certainly seems like they are focusing even more on what he does well in terms of being one of the best vertical passers in the NFL. So you bring in a Brandon Cooks, and Randall Cobb obviously had the exact same average depth of target that DeAndre Hopkins had last year. And hopefully Tim Kelly unlocks that layup element to Deshaun Watson's game where you can really use David Johnson and Duke Johnson. Hayden, going to you, we hear all about volume so often in fantasy football. Well, one of the names on this list of the top 6 that we just mentioned might have the least amount of volume of them all, and that is Russell Wilson. Yet you have him number 4 in your rankings. Obviously, we love Russ. We love DK. We love Tyler Lockett. We love a lot of elements of this offense. But what gives you the belief that he's going to get enough opportunity to make good on that ranking?
Yeah, like you said, the Seahawks were 23rd in pass attempts last year. But there's a couple things working in his favor this season. First of all, last year the Seahawks played well above expectations. There's a chance, at least what the math says, is that the Seahawks are going to be trailing a little bit more so than they did last season. So that would be positive news for Russell Wilson and his passing volumes. But even without it, the last 6 years, he's been a top 5 quarterback in 4 of the last 6 seasons. That includes a couple top 3 finishes as well. His upside's through the roof if they do pass the ball a little bit more. And like you said, it's DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I think this is probably the best wide receiver duo he's ever had in his career. And that even includes the Doug Baldwin days. And there's even still some rumors that maybe they signed Antonio Brown or Josh Gordon if they can get a couple weeks out of them too. So I think that the range of outcomes is a little bit wider than you would expect from a top 6 player. But the upside is enormous if they can pass the ball a little bit more.
I don't even know if the range of outcomes is disastrously, though. Like, this is a team that ran the ball at the 6th highest rate in neutral game script last year, and yet he still finished top 5 in fantasy points per game. So I think his floor is top 6, and then his ceiling is QB1 overall. I don't think he'll get there. I don't think he can trump Mahomes or Jackson, given how little he runs. But the safety net of being inside the top 6 every year, despite the offense he plays in, is what I think you're catering to here.
Well, and the other thing about
Russell Wilson's also kind of like regression proof when it comes to touchdown percentage. Yeah. He's like one of the top touchdown percentage quarterbacks of the era, and that's been year after year right in that the 6 range, which is just completely elite. And yeah, he's an elite quarterback, and he finds the end zone, and he's got one of the best 2 receiver sets in the NFL.
The one quick thing I wanted to add, with everybody in this tier, all 4 quarterbacks, there are very easy avenues to stacking them with their wide receivers. I mean, a lot of mid-round targets. We're talking about Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, Christian Kirk earlier, CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup. All these guys have players to stack with. So I think that this tier could be valuable as long as you're not reaching for them. I'm talking about like a 7th round pick. That's when you should be targeting these guys.
And absolutely no coincidence that all 4 have at least some rushing floor to their game or upside, even if you want to say that in the red zone as well. All right, let's go to the next tier. More names in this list, 6 of them. And I've kind of separated them into 2 groupings. It's the upsides and Carson Wentz, Matthew Stafford, and Josh Allen versus the reliables, the guys that have done it for year in and year out, and Matt Ryan and Tom Brady and Drew Brees. Personally, of this group, I'm aiming for upside, and I'm going with Carson Wentz every single time. 1, I want to ask if I'm wrong, but 2, let me make my point because, I understand that Carson Wentz last year was the quarterback 13 in fantasy points per game. We actually have him as the quarterback 8. He's going around the quarterback 11 in fantasy drafts, and so we have him well above consensus. But I mean, again, quarterback 13 fantasy points per game last year with absolute scrubs at wide receiver. We get Deshaun Jackson back. We add Jalen Reagor. Hopefully some other names step up in Alshon Jeffrey's absence. You get Miles Sanders for an entire season. Pat, I see an absolute blow-up spot potential in a good way for Carson Wentz in 2020 behind still a top 10 offensive line in the NFL.
I do too. I mean, I will say this isn't the first time we've hyped Carson Wentz coming into a season, and he hasn't quite delivered. But I mean, what he did in the second half of last season was nothing short of heroic, with Greg Ward as his number 1 receiver. And he's got that mix you look for in a real-life quarterback and a fantasy quarterback of efficiency and explosion. And he hasn't quite been able to get it going down the field, not because he doesn't have the arm strength or the talent, but just because he didn't have the personnel. And the Eagles have, again, aggressively addressed that. But this time, how healthy Deshaun Jackson coming back, and then a first-round pick, Jalen Reagor. And just a much deeper supporting cast this year, a much more balanced supporting cast this year. They should have that missing element of the deep ball. And Carson Wentz, also a great athlete. He's not going to give you really rushing statage in fantasy, but a great athlete too. And he's just the whole package of what you look for in a fantasy quarterback. And didn't quite deliver last year in fantasy, but everything points to this year being the year.
Talk about healthy, and that has been a question to end seasons for Carson Wentz. John Daigle, Matthew Stafford, if he had continued his health from the first half of the season and played a full 16 game slate last year, we were looking at a most likely top 5 quarterback in fantasy football.
It wasn't just top 5 quarterback. After he finished with the 4th most fantasy points per game in his 8 starts, it was a top 5 offense. Like, that offense in those 8 starts averaged 25.5 points per game and 6 yards per play. Everything changed once Stafford got injured. He is reportedly healthy at camp right now. We'll know because they're about to start practicing. He will be available and under center so we can find out more. I don't think you're wrong about Carson Wentz. I think you're wrong to say he'll outproduce Matt Ryan and Matthew Stafford 10 out of 10 times, because I think that's the tier. The thing is, there's nothing left in Matt Ryan's ceiling because we know who he is now. Even just most recently, back-to-back years of 600 attempts and at least 17 fantasy points per game, there is no ceiling to his game. He's capped, and it's a good projection, but it is the same projection over and over again. The one I think is still the outlier here is Josh Allen. Just to average 7 carries and 27 career starts is sustainable production, and that's how you trump those statues who don't run but are still effective throwers, is that you get involved on your legs, and Josh Allen clearly has shown he can do that the past 2 years.
Hayden, anyone in this tier stand out to you? Because again, we focused all the conversation on Wentz, Stafford, and Josh Allen and have forgotten totally about the vanilla of Matt Ryan, Tom Brady, and Drew Brees.
Yeah, if you were telling me or asking me to pick one of these guys, I would also pick Matt Ryan, just because I think the Falcons are going to be first or second in passing volume, and they have really strong weapons and even an improved offensive line. Plus, they'll be trailing because the division's so strong. But going over to Tom Brady and Drew Brees, we're dealing with quarterbacks that we just don't really have a full grasp of what they could actually perform this year. Talking specifically about Drew Brees, I'm not convinced that he's going to be on the field like with inside the 10-yard line every single time, just because they actually want to use Taysom Hill. So that's a possible concern. That's why I've dropped him a little bit. But I agree with Daigle. It's the Josh Allen, Carson Wentz, Matthew Stafford, Matt Ryan guys out of this tier that I want to be targeting, and kind of avoiding Tom Brady and Drew Brees.
All right, so
I
we've
say
hit
something about Stafford.
Go ahead.
I've heard so much from John about Stafford. It's not hyperbole. I mean, Stafford last year was basically playing a more efficient version of Jameis Winston ball, where his average depth of target was almost 2 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. Only 2 other quarterbacks were even above 0.6 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. So he was throwing beyond the sticks every play and at a much deeper rate than almost any other quarterback. And Pro Football Focus's deep percentage was passes that are at least 20 yards in the air was almost 20%. And Russell Wilson was second at 16.9%. So we basically saw like a completely new Matthew Stafford last year. And I mean, they were having great success with it, as we know. So they should be sticking with this approach. And Stafford is someone kind of getting lost in the shuffle this summer.
And most importantly, continuity, because nothing has changed for that offense. They added one of the best pass-catching running backs in the draft with DeAndre Swift. But for wide receivers, it's still Golladay, Marvin Jones, and Danny Amendola locking up the 3 spots.
Yep, you definitely have to mention Danny Amendola in every podcast.
He's still the starting slot right now.
All right, we've ran through the top 12 quarterbacks. As we open this conversation, maybe the way to win your fantasy draft is to find that next Patrick Mahomes, to find that next Lamar Jackson. And in their drafts where they really exploded in a season, they were taken outside the top 9, top 10 quarterback names. So every other quarterback is on the table here. Which name do you want to talk about, Hayden Winks?
Well, I'm not going to be promising Lamar Jackson numbers here, but if you're waiting to the 14th round and Joe Burrow is your quarterback and he produces like a top 10, top 12 fantasy quarterback throughout this year, that's a win. I think that Joe Burrow is being slept on a little bit for two reasons. One, there's the passing volume with the Bengals offense. They have the skill position players to match it. They were 6th in pass attempts last year. I think that Joe Burrow is probably going to be top 10 in pass attempts this year just because the Bengals are going to be trailing. They're 31st in total win projection this year. And then number 2, Joe Burrow is a dual threat quarterback. He's not like Lamar Jackson per se, but in college, he averaged 24 yards per carry, but that includes his sack yardage, which works against him. If you remove that sack yardage, he's up to like 39 rushing yards per game. If that translates over to the NFL, that is something that's not being accounted for in fantasy drafts, in fantasy rankings. I see him like down as the quarterback 20 a lot. I have him all the way up inside my top 15.
This is a good conversation to have. So I actually want to go to each of you to name one of these quarterbacks. Pat, you have the floor to sell one other quarterback name that we have not mentioned.
So yeah, the question earlier was where would I take Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson, and my answer was going to be it's just not something that really even enters into like my thought process, because the way to win is try to find the next one. And this year is kind of lacking obvious candidates. Joe Burrow does really stick out. I do wonder really if Joe Burrow is going to be running anywhere close to that much in the NFL. Kind of a product of being in an unreal good designed offense against college competition, but clearly a superior athlete and what could still remain an element of his game. I mean, there's no true obvious, like Mahomes was kind of obvious the year he did it. Lamar was kind of obvious last year. There's no one like that unless you want to count Josh Allen or Kyler Murray. If you're thinking way down board, like someone who's like for free, I am not saying this will happen. I mean, Drew Lock has that kind of explosive playmaking ability. Someone you really want it to be usually a dual threat though. I mean, someone else free, Tua Tagovailoa could maybe be someone I would stash on my bench for a few weeks and see how they have him play the quarterback position. He didn't have great rushing yardage at Alabama, but he is a great athletic quarterback. But there's no obvious Mahomes, Lamar Jackson life hack this year, unless you want to say it's Josh Allen or Kyler Murray.
Daigle?
I don't know if I've ever talked about Gardner Minshew of the AFC Championship Jaguars on this podcast before, and this video before as well. But I will say Minshew, before he got benched, QB 10 overall in fantasy points per game, behind 5 carries per game, and the Jaguars have the 4th softest projected passing schedule and 4th softest slate of defenses. That's why I like them. They have an easy schedule, and I believe they have talent and playmakers on offense, despite what everyone else thinks.
You guys are going really deep. One, I appreciate that. I'll keep it a little more surface level and throw out 2 names, Ben Roethlisberger and Cam Newton, okay? Because both of these players are coming off injuries. I think it's been forgotten about how good they have been when the last time they were healthy. I mean, Ben in 2018 was a top 3 quarterback in fantasy points per game. And if he comes back, and I understand he had surgery on multiple ligaments in his arm, like that is,
Great.
Yeah, that is not good. If you could select a quarterback that didn't have that would be preferable. But he's also coming back to an offense that is explosive. One that, sure, will be without Antonio Brown from the last time he played, but I think you can put up massive production with Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, whoever they want to try out there as a 3rd wide receiver, and Eric Ebron in the middle of the field. Plus, now we get Cam Newton with one of the best offensive minds in the NFL and Josh McDaniels, an offensive line that I still think is very talented. And I think you can absolutely question how explosive Mohamed Sanu and N'Keal Harry are. And, Julian Edelman is like 34 years old. But I still think Cam Newton has a lot left. And I'm excited to see him in an actually good franchise to see what they can do with him in 2020. So those would be 2 names outside the top 12 quarterbacks right now that I could see ending as top 5 quarterbacks in the year.
It's kind of criminal that none of us mentioned Daniel Jones, by the way, who's right there in the Cam tier.
Got it.
The first 6 weeks of the Giants' schedule is an absolute disaster for Daniel Jones. So much so that I would stress not even drafting him, because someone in your league is either going to drop him, or if you feel like you must draft him for the rushing floor, then go ahead and also grab Jimmy Garoppolo or Joe Burrow, someone with an easier opening schedule, even Minshew. That way you can stash Jones and not worry about those first 6 weeks.
All right, let's close the quarterback conversation there. If you want more of our rankings at every single position or any type of scoring format, you can even enter your own scoring formats into our premium products. Go over to rotoworld.com/edge, and there you can sign up for an annual subscription, a monthly subscription. It's our draft guide, it's our season pass, it's season-long tools, everything you absolutely need. Again, that is rotoworld.com/edge. And if you want more conversations just like this, go over and check out the Rotoworld Football Podcast.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.